Human decisions always have consequences. Whenever one decides to do something, one's action affects other people in ways beyond how one thought it would. In making decisions, one either looks to one's motives and to the foreseeable consequences of one's actions. Oftentimes, decisions are judged as good if they are brought about by good and just motives and results in good consequences. On the contrary, decisions are considered bad if they are motivated by anything most of society deems as malicious, such as selfishness, spite, or envy, and if they have destructive consequences. However, one's motives are not always pure, and consequences vary in kind and severity depending on those affected. Utilitarianism is a moral theory that tries to grapple with these questions. John Stuart Mill is considered by many to be the most influential. His utilitarian theory of morality is a development and clarification of the earlier form of the theory authored by Jeremy Bentham and his father, which essentially states that it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of the right and wrong. Happiness in this context is understood as a predominance of pleasure over pain. Mill's moral theory is considered as consequentialist in that it judges the rightness and wrongness of actions based on their consequences. Mill holds that happiness is the goal of morality. Therefore, one sees the importance of community in making moral choices.
Happiness as defined by Mill is pleasure and the absence of pain, while unhappiness is pain or the absence of pleasure. For him, the principle of utility or the greatest happiness principle is the supreme measure of morality. Pleasure and the freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, and all desirable things are desired either because they are inherently pleasurable or because they contribute to the prevention of pain.
Next, we have our replies to objections. Let's gonna talk more further of this. With the help of the happiness is unattainable, the utilitarian morality is incompatible with self-sacrifice, and lastly, the social concern that is rare motive for action. Happiness is unattainable. Mill deals with in his treatise is the objection relating to the question whether people have actually society whenever they choose a course of action. Mill says that a life of happiness defined in his theory is not a life of rapture, but an existence made up of a few transitory pains, different pleasures with a decided predominance of pleasure over pain. Utilitarian morality is incompatible with self-sacrifice. Mill answers this objection by saying that utilitarianism does recognize the goodness of self-sacrifice, which places the welfare of others over and above one's own, but only to the extent that it is done for the sake of promoting happiness of the greatest number. A person must be as impartial as possible in weighing on his or her happiness against that of others. For social concern is a rare motive for action. The last objection of Mill deals with in his treatise is the objection relating to the question whether people actually have society in mind whenever they choose a course of action. Mill says that a great number of actions are meant to benefit individuals rather than the greater majority. For an examples, to the objection that happiness is unattainable, many things such as poverty, disease, and failure thwarts one's attempt at being happy. To the objection that utilitarian morality is incompatible with self-sacrifice, it ascribes to Jesus Christ's teaching to love one's neighbor as oneself, expressing how utilitarianism values the other person as much as oneself. And lastly, to the objection that social concern is a rare motive for action. If one saves a fellow human person from being tricked by a conman for the sake of gaining favors from the act and not simply because one is motivated by duty to look after one's neighbor, the morality of the act is not diminished in the least. And that is all for the objections and replies.
So let's talk about the ultimate sanctions. Utilitarianism can impose all the sanctions that other moral systems can. Mill notes that there exist both external and internal sanctions. So the external sanctions exist externally to the human agents as individuals. So the external sanctions are outside punishment, and for example, people think that if they act immorally, their reputations will be destroyed or God will punish them. For utilitarianism, these external sanctions express the ultimate moral principle of maximizing utility. Good reputation is an award for acting a common good, and God wants to maximize his creature of happiness. And next is internal sanction. Feeling in our own mind arising from conscience that can create discomfort when one's violates duty. So internal sanctions is an actor or own feeling or pain and displeasure at the idea of acting immorally. Their moral conscience. Mill admit that some people lack conscience and only act morally due to external sanctions. But things that most people conscience can be cultivated in accord with utilitarianism, as any other moral ideals. Internal sanctions provide the strongest influence other people's action. Hence, utilitarianism must appeal to people's inner sentiments in order to exercise a binding force on them. Thus, Mill argues that once general happiness becomes recognized as the moral standard, natural sentiments will nurture feelings that promote utilitarianism. Mill argues that society could and nourish these natural sentiments through education and law. In short, Mill thinks that people follow moral rules either because other people force them to or because they feel good when they do what is right and bad things when they do what is wrong. He thinks that good society need these sanctions, which encourage people to do what is right, and therefore utilitarians should actively promote both of them. This means fighting for a moral better system of laws and public accountability and building a culture in which people see their action as moral important, an internalized principle of right and wrong. That's all.
Utilitarianism comes hand in hand with the greatest happiness principle, which emphasizes that actions are right if they promote the happiness of the greatest number and wrong if they cause the opposite. Mill stated that there is a distinction between the quality and quantity of happiness or pleasure and that the pleasure of the mind is considered higher than the pleasure of the flesh. Therefore, utilitarianism promotes a moral way of life that takes into account the welfare of the community and not just one's own. Mill declares that utilitarianism is the ultimate sanction of the principle of utility. In the context of community, quantitatively and qualitatively thinking about the consequences of one's action is to be moral. To contribute to the happiness or pleasure and to decrease the feeling of pain of others is one's realization of true moral life. So before we end this topic, I would like to share that in following utilitarianism, there are two specific approaches that one can choose from: the act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. The act utilitarianism emphasizes that regardless of the situation, one must choose the action that produces the greatest good for the greatest number. For instance, giving money to charity is considered right in act utilitarianism because it can make many people happy rather than just oneself. Meanwhile, rule utilitarianism emphasizes that one must follow rules that are likely to lead to the greatest good for the greatest number. In relation with the previous example, the rule would be share your wealth.